What's wrong with the Russians? Why do they support war in Ukraine? And if they don't support it, why don't they protest against the Putin regime and stop the war? Analyzing the web, we realized it may be challenging to find answers due to long-term relatedness. Doubts and misunderstandings are reasonable. In the next 20 minutes I will bring answers, or at least some of them. My name is Kirill Storm. Let's begin. Russia now is a country of one huge deception, a country with the most cunning propaganda and electoral system, a country where real citizen opinion can be found due to information distribution restrictions and lack of transparency. 2014 became dramatic for several reasons. Perception of the Winter Olympic Games in Sochi, Ukrainian Maidan, and the following Crimea annexation changed a lot over a decade. Here we need to mention that since the start of 2010 in Russian TV, not much attention had been paid to actual Russia, but Ukraine. The effect of our Crimea in Russian society lasted for a few years after 2014. Our Crimea, thanks to propaganda, became a patriotic wave after the short, almost bloodless occupation, which raised Putin's rating by 20 percentage points approximately. But a lot of Russians were not so happy and tried to protest. Famous March of Peace involved around 100,000 participants, including famous artists and politicians. Later, street rallies slowly decreased. During this time, the Kremlin has repeatedly increased pressure on political opponents. Boris Nemtsov, who used to be a member of parliament and head of Nizhny Novgorod region, who criticized Russian policy towards Ukraine, was killed right in the center of Moscow, 100 meters from the Kremlin, in 2015. Although the place of assassination became a bridge of massive mooring, not many people protested. Protest moods returned in 2017. Alexei Navalny announced his intention to apply for presidency, his program, and also released a major corruption investigation into Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, but Navalny was denied as a presidential candidate. Officially, due to unexpunged conviction in a fabricated criminal case. This became the reason for numerous rallies and demonstrations throughout Russia. The Russian government began to indirectly prohibit public opinion expressions. In order to prevent these activities, the Russian government invented completely fictitious pretexts, and many refusals were not argued at all. Uncoordinated rallies became the reason for the detention of protest leaders for 15 days. Before we proceed, let's mention major public protests which occurred since 2014. Hopefully, this helps to negate the opinion that Russians do not protest. He's not a demon for you. Has 45 million YouTube viewers currently. Investigation movies from ACF uncovered habits and property of Russian ex-president Dmitry Medvedev, who became really crazy nowadays. In March 2017, many people came to the streets, which became a huge step to drop Medvedev from political arena. Now you may know the Russian ex-president as an Western hater, rude and inadequate. Telegram became a widely famous messenger in Russia. Government force and intelligence services could not control traffic and information distribution through Telegram and decided to prohibit respectful usage. In April 2018, Roskomnadzor and the court officially blocked Telegram. Well, they tried to. But the Russian government has been living in virtual reality for too long time. This caused several protests over the next months. Most famous is a meeting for Telegram support and internet freedom. Telegram went through this case, gathering more and more users in the process. VPN services became more casual and popular. Multiple times over his rulership, Putin made promises and almost always ruined them later. Several such words-breaking caused protests. Pension age changing became impactful. Putin decides now women must work till 63 years old instead of 55, and for men till 65 instead of 60, respectively. Street protests started in summer 2018, right after the Football World Cup ended, because earlier we felt hospitality and street events hard restrictions. Over the next months, people continued to protest and rallied more than 1,000 events, although none of them brought changes in pension age reform. Being a journalist in Russia may be dangerous, and we have a worth mention case from summer 2019. Large impact was caused by a high-profile case against journalist Ivan Golunov, who was planted with drugs by police during a search. Golunov used to work with Meduza.io, and thanks to the journalist community, the case immediately became very public. People showed up on the streets, followed by a wide media company. In the end of 2020, all 5 involved policemen were sentenced to imprisonment. Ivan Golunov received compensation and is now free. Moscow city parliament elections used to be interesting due to related powers in Duma and huge capital city budget access. Back in 2019, opposition in Russia already had no voices and powers, so they tried to catch this opportunity. Some of them were cut from nomination by administrative barriers or due to open criminal cases, for earlier street events or social media posts mostly. In July 2019, multiple protests went through Moscow demanding free admission for all candidates. At least 20,000 people shone on the streets. Unfortunately, Moscow city parliament feels not real and not respected nowadays. Most eastern part of Russia showed surprise in July 2020. Their elected governor was arrested by federal force on charges of orchestrating 2 murders and brought to Moscow court all over Russia despite what law says in these circumstances. Lots of people in Khabarovsk came to the streets, returning massively every Saturday over months. Protests were occasionally supported in other cities, but really continuous and massive they became in Khabarovsk. At this time, COVID-related restrictions regarding street crowds was already accepted, but it seems like the government just did not have will or force this time to shut up citizens and did not want to be responsible. Protesting people demanded transparency and to proceed with the case at the local Khabarovsk court. Instead, they received an inadequate clone for the governor position. And recently, Furgal was officially judged in Moscow and imprisoned for 22 years. Navalny was poisoned during his tour over Russian regions to support upcoming Duma elections campaign from the opposition side. He survived, which is completely another story you may find in Navalny movie nominated for Oscar awards. After partial recovery in Germany, he decides to fly back home early 2021 and was detained immediately in the airport. Moreover, the government changed the arrival airport suddenly from Vnukovo to Sheremetyevo, while the plane was approaching Moscow, likely in order to lessen people in the airport who wanted to meet Navalny with greetings. Over the next few months, Alexei Navalny was sent to court due to an overstepping probation period during which he had to show up, but he could not due to a coma after the poisoning attempt, although the court thinks it is barely inconvenience and sent Navalny to prison. Bunch of people protested and thousands became subject to detainment. As you likely understand, over time, detentions began to concern ordinary citizens who came to peacefully express their dissatisfaction with the authorities on the streets, but also those who just appeared nearby. Over a couple years, police brutality during arrests or detained actions had multiplied. Without leaders and within an atmosphere of fear, protests decreased. To put the opposition under more pressure, enforcement representatives goes wider. Administrative barriers wherever you can imagine. Threats to students to kick out from university. Threats in the budget sector, being fired or even face criminal prosecutions. Social media to mix famous persons with shit. House searches in the early morning around 5 a.m., including relatives. Poison or bullets for those in opposition who should represent people in parliament. All sorts of protests were marginalized. Criminal cases fabrication slowly became more usual. Propaganda highlighted demonstration cases to bring fear and action uselessness. Out of all COVID restrictions, still remains only one: public events restriction, which surely is the number one reason to administratively deny every opposition application. For those who peacefully protested in the streets, force representatives easily use a lot of violence and easily provide stressful night in police quarters, and criminal prosecutions for few thereafter. Separately, it is worth talking about the Navalny headquarters, which were essentially a political party, although with official registration denied. There were dozens such headquarters in multiple Russian cities. The police often broke into them and confiscated their equipment. Staff members and heads of regional offices were regularly detained. Soon after Navalny was poisoned, the Putin regime officially named the respectful organization as extremist. After the new war phase started in 2022, articles appeared for discrediting the Russian army. It became impossible to be indignant, not only in the street outside, but also at home inside, on the internet. Despite all the obstacles, some brave Russians have continued to express their opinions publicly. Many had to leave their country, as the risks have multiplied. More than 1 million likely left Russia since the war escalated in February 2022. Some of them do not support war, some of them are not ready to be mobilized, some due to economical factors. But all the opposition politicians who could not be forced out of the country went to jail. Yashin, Golunov, Kara-Murza, Roizman. Besides these famous names, thousands of different people were imprisoned as an outcome of protests. Conditions in Russian prison usually full of humiliation and generally close to torture. There is an opinion that Russians support war, although things are not so easy. Opinion polls show that more than 90% of Russians just refuse to answer because open opposition and participation in such public polls may cause repressions, even words "I'm against the war" literally. It is pretty common for Russians to not have their own opinion, circumstances of propaganda and lack of trustworthy elections. So now you are aware that Russians are trying to protest. And we do not even mention partisans who sabotage war logistics and administration during military aggression, even though it is a really low percent of population. You may ask, why are most Russians so passive and afraid of standing for their rights in future? Well, some deep of reasons are below. Imperial fascism and nationalism legacy, unreflected and unfinished totalitarian past hinders the development of country. When the country and society tried to build democracy, a KGB officer became president. Wide poverty causes lack of basic education and thriving to earn money despite morality and sometimes law. Incompetent and unvirtuous elites, the result of a century-long negative selection. Low level of trust in society and low ability to self-organize from below, partially a result of the trauma of the Red Terror. Due to the tax and economic system, not enough funds or power in regions to stand against Moscow Kremlin, either forcefully in legal or information areas. Low transparency of social and political institutions. Last time we saw a large protest in Russia 11 years ago, and since no person in parliament has been representing any real interests of Russian society. Theory suggests 3–5% of actively protesting citizens would be enough to change the regime peacefully. It is about 5 million people, which sounds insanely many in comparison with usual street protests. It is pretty doubtful. What conditions should match in order to see other huge protests in Russia? We can just guess. And you can guess in the comments as well.